Good morning and a warm welcome to all of you. It is so lovely to see all of you here today. I am Aditya Ramchandran and I'm your host for today's session. ICICI Bank believes that learning is not restricted to one's own sector or area of work. We believe that we can draw insights and inspirations from the work of leaders in different domains and apply these learnings. The 12 by 12 Ignite series is around the same premise, where renowned experts and thought leaders from different fields are invited to share their expertise, experiences, and lessons in leadership. I would like to take this opportunity to extend a warm welcome to our honorable guest, Lt Gen Raj Shukla, for today's session. In his illustrious career, spanning over 4 decades in the Indian Army, Lt Gen Raj Shukla has seen extensive service in the field, such as commanding an infantry brigade in counterinsurgency operations, the Baramulla division along the line of control in the Kashmir Valley, and a pivot corps along the western borders. He is an alumnus of the Defence Services Staff College, Wellington, the College of Defence Management, Secunderabad, and National Defence College, New Delhi. He has served 2 tenures at the Military Operations Directorate, dealing with doctrines and force structuring, and was the Director General, Perspective Planning, addressing issues relating to military futures and force modernization. He has also been a commandant of the Indian Army's prestigious training establishment and think tank, the Army War College. A professional aviator and a powerful orator, General Shukla has an abiding interest in strategic military affairs. He has authored close to 70 articles and publications and lectured in more than 180 talks and seminars in both in India and abroad. As the 22nd General Officer Commanding-in-Chief, Army Commander of the Indian Army's Training Command, Lt General Shukla made noteworthy contributions to the development of India's strategic military futures, technological innovations, professional military education, capacity building, operational poise, and civil military fusion. In recognition of his service of the most exceptional order, he was awarded the Param Vishisht Seva Medal on Republic Day 2021. The Honorable President was pleased to appoint Lt General Shukla to the office of Member UPSC with effect from 18 July 2022. It's a real privilege to have you with us here today, sir. Before we start, I would like to give a brief on the flow of the session. We would have Lt General Shukla addressing us, followed by a Q&A session. For our colleagues joined on Teams, I request you to please put your questions on the chat board. I now call upon our Executive Director, Mr. Sandeep Batra, to felicitate Lt General Raj Shukla. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Batra. I would now hand over the podium to Lt General Raj Shukla for the session.
Mr. Sandeep Bakshi, Managing Director and CEO of the ICICI Bank, Executive Directors Mr. Anup Bagchi, Mr. Rakesh Jha, and Mr. Sandeep Batra, the rank and file of the ICICI, those of you that are present physically, those that have joined online, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by saying that it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. Leadership is a subject that has invoked great interest in me. And why me? Most military officers, because we primarily deal with leadership. So it's a subject that we love to explore. And I say explore with a purpose because leadership is such a challenging domain that it is extremely difficult to master. There can be only constant reflection, mutual learning through exchanges like these, but these exchanges are very important because they help you to grow as a leader, and constant betterment. It is also a domain of great unpredictability, surprises, and may I say some very checkered destinies, varying fortunes. So the Prime Minister Narendra Modi is perhaps a good way to begin. His life and times are a fascinating study in leadership. If you keep the politics apart, just his life. I recall it was sometime in 2011 when I was a brigadier at the National Defence College. And from there we go touring these states. And out of the 10 states, I think in 6 of them the Chief Secretary turned up. But in almost none, the Chief Minister didn't find the time. Mr. Modi was then Chief Minister of Gujarat. And when we went there, he spent 3.5 hours with us, listening, probing, asking questions about the army, how we function, how we operate, the larger issues of national security. And then there was, at that time, not even the talk. I mean, there were these whispers, but no loud talk of this prospect of his becoming the Prime Minister. And when I look back, it is this diligence, what you may call tapasya, that has brought him here. It's because this is an incident that I have seen firsthand. Why should a Chief Minister of a state spend 3.5 hours with a military gathering? But he was doing that. And so perhaps those larger leadership traits were always lurking within his persona. And they began to flower and prosper. And they kind of got together at a time in our history when our fascination with the old idea of India was beginning to fade. And I'm not making a political point here, please don't misunderstand. But that was a time, if you recall, where we had many of these abstract promises, poor delivery, there was a sense of drift, waywardness, all those corruption movements. I recall I was just discussing, there's this very famous historian and a great historian, Ramchandra Guha. He would give these talks in Delhi, but those talks were strangely captioned, 10 reasons why we don't need to become a superpower, 10 reasons why India should not become a superpower. And somebody like me used to always, when I used to sit in those gatherings, I used to wonder, I mean, such a great historian, but why this sense of waywardness, this drift, this purposelessness? Now, that is what this Prime Minister has changed greatly. When he tells you about Amrit Kal, see, Amrit Kal is not only just, all the good stars coming together. It's a carefully thought through enterprise which says that this is our time in history, and if we don't deliver in the next 25 years, we will become old before we get rich, if you see the demographics, and so on and so forth. And it was his persona and this change in our history, or in our historical fortunes, which kind of have come together, and they are now zenithing or peaking in a different era. So this is what I say, it's not only the leadership traits, are always perhaps lurking within us, but they have to get together in terms of time, in terms of a larger purpose, and they seem to have happened in this case. In this avatar, he seems to be extremely tall, unchallenged in very different ways, and this whole dream of an aspirational India, along with the persona of the Prime Minister, seem to be coming together. So a leader also needs, these circumstances. The other thing that we must really take from his life is that he didn't go to any of these good schools or so-called good schools, none of these fancy universities. He schooled himself in RSS shakhas. I remember when I went to NDA, if you had been to an RSS shakha, you couldn't join the National Defence Academy. It was absolutely an outlier plus. It was not part of the system. But something was perhaps happening in those shakhas that gave you leaders of this kind. And I remember when I was the army commander in Shimla, there was still a lot of talk. Mr. Modi had spent time as a Prabhari there. They would say he would come to these tea shops, these nukkad stalls, and spend a lot of time there talking about the politics, what people want. So his leadership has been one of deep introspection, reflection, learning, diligence, tapasya. I'm told he has spent one day in every district in India before he has become Prime Minister. Now that says something. The army is known to go all over the place. I can't claim to have spent one day in every city in India. So leaders do not happen by circumstance. They invest greatly in leadership. And what is most fascinating today is that he has such a forward-looking, perspicacious view of India. I think for the first time, the political leadership seems to be ahead of the civil, military, technological, administrative bureaucracies in terms of goal setting, in terms of saying do this, in terms of thinking 30 years ahead. And we are the guys who are caught up in saying, nahi, ye is wajah se ye nahi ho sakta, isme ye problem hai, isko thoda aur time chahiye. When we were young, we never ceased in the army cursing the politician that he couldn't think right, he was too slow. The wheel has come full circle in the persona of Mr. Modi. And look at some of the things that we have done. Digital India. The Americans acknowledge that our digital public infrastructure is better than theirs. I've heard this from so many Americans. And at the highest level, terror. I remember in 2004, 5, 6, we were told, oh, see, India is a raucous democracy. One guy will always get through. So har roz kahin na kahin bomb phatta tha. But we're on top of terror. I mean, touch wood. There has really been nothing. Look at the goals that have been set. Global leadership in millets. I mean, I didn't know millet could be such a thing. What is it called? Bada chana or something. And we are holding conferences in millets. There's 65 countries, represented in 65 countries across the world. So in some sense, we are now positioning ourselves as a global hub for green hydrogen. So this thinking big, this whole atmosphere of thinking long, thinking deep. Look at the vaccination or the vaccine. I mean, we'll come to this a little later, that China leads in all technologies, but it hasn't been able to get its act together in terms of the vaccine. We not only got the vaccine, we got it administered. So this is, sir, look at this Jan Dhan, this jam business, the Jan Dhan accounts, the Aadhaar and the mobile. They have been game-changing. So, I mean, so even if we have any political differences, these issues about the Prime Minister are simply mind-boggling, and they are a great inspiration for leadership. In my view, his most significant contribution is that India is a raucous democracy today, all right, but one that also delivers. In the past, it didn't seem to be delivering. It is no longer an excuse for non-delivery. And so that is the big change. Look at the another example, President Zelensky, Ashraf Ghani. So Zelensky, we all know, is the president of Ukraine. He may have faded away as this great sitcom star, and that is all that he was, a sitcom star and a very marginal politician. But Putin has given him this Churchillian status. I've actually heard leading commentators describing him as, his contributions as the Churchill of the 21st century. Now that's saying a lot. And he's also lived up to the famous name in terms of courage, determination, calmness, and resolve. You see all this happening. The way he has, brought this whole Ukrainian resistance together, it's absolutely mind-boggling. Look at the way he's used Musk's Starlink terminals to communicate with global councils, and the US Congress one day, the British Parliament another, the European Union on a third day, getting together international opinion. He's used that to get street resolve growing. It's not easy. All these civilians who've got together in Kiev and Bakhmut and all these cities, they need leadership. Also to get troop morale going. These are all remarkable achievements. And you contrast him with Ashraf Ghani. Ashraf Ghani, I'm not making any adverse comment on Ashraf Ghani. These are just, studies in leadership. Ashraf Ghani had ticked all the right boxes. He was a renowned academic, economist, been to the best of American universities, Columbia, World Bank, finance minister, vice chancellor of the Kabul University. But when Zelensky was offered the ride out, instinctively he refused the ride and said, I want 1,500 helmets. And those helmets became javelins, and they became the Leopards, and they became the Challengers. Now they are fighter jets. But he refused the ride out. Ashraf Ghani took the ride out. He took the ride out. And so in that critical moment of your destiny in leadership, one peaked and one simply disappeared into oblivion. So this is what, leadership can be. So it's not always exclusively a personal endeavor, often the product of the times. Sometimes the moment finds the man, and sometimes the man seizes the moment. So it's all of these things coming together. But one thing is certain, that all these events you will see that they rhyme with history. There is a sense of timing. And so another, thing in leadership is that we must study history more seriously. In India, we just don't do it. There is a famous historian, Neil Ferguson, he's a British historian. Those of you who read him will know what I'm saying. Those of you who don't, I strongly urge that you read him. He has used history with mathematical precision. He predicted the pandemic, and well ahead of the time it happened. He predicted the Ukraine conflict. He was the lone voice who was arguing that it would occur. When everybody was telling you that, nahi, shayad, ifs, buts. As a result of which, he has put together this leading think tank called Fremantle, which leading governments pay for by billions of dollars just to get that advice. So this is what, history, your deep understanding of it, your fruitful use of it, can do. So it's not only a domain in leadership, but a money-spinning venture. So this is what, history can do. In our case, history somehow is the way, for example, I was taught history. It's comical. I remember why one took a dislike to history because we were told, okay, you get up, please read para 3. You get up, please read para 4. You read para 11, sit down, now take a break. And then in the exam, you would get all kinds of dates which made no sense, 1525, 1646. So it became a rote exercise. And many of these good historians, how they teach you history is by telling you, see how in the Industrial Revolution, the feminist movement got a fillip. So these diverse aspects of history. So India seriously lacks, good historians. But the point, really about this Zelensky Ashraf is this, that it is not the size of the dog in the fight, but the fight in the dog that matters. And there are repeated examples in terms of statecraft, this whole India-China bit, we can do far more better in terms of our asymmetric challenging of China. Let me give you one small example. So the American defense budget is 3.54 times that of China. The Chinese defense budget is 3.5 times or something like that of India. Why is it that China is causing displacement anxiety in Pentagon and we do not cause similar displacement anxiety in Beijing? It's not just a matter of budgets. There are a whole lot of other changes in the domain of human rights, structural reforms like theater commands, this whole transition to digital combat, the larger game of technology beyond the military, this whole strategic military sweep. So these are the issues, of asymmetric balancing and so on that can be done. So history, leadership, there are no textbook prescriptions. All those of us who are older will realize this. In my view, you cross the river of leadership by feeling the stones. You develop your unique model suited to your own persona and genius. What works for me may not work for you, but there comes a stage in life when you discover that this is your USP, this is your persona, and this is the leadership style that you have, and you can make use of this leadership style. And with some examples as we go on, I think I'll try and drive home this point. So you must try and mold your persona to fit the opportunity and the changing world. Sense and feel your way to excellence as a leader. It will not happen in one day, but you will see, and as you grow in service, you will realize in your career or in your service that you are striking the right chords, that your leadership is beginning to make an impact. And there comes a time when you realize that your leadership now has achieved that level of traction that you can transform. And when that moment comes, do not hesitate. And I'll speak from personal experience. Let me also say, I should have prefaced it right in the beginning, that whatever I tell you, you may not agree with me, you may disagree with me, but what I will speak today will be of complete honesty. So that is how humongous a challenge is leadership. It's not an exact science. That's the whole problem. It's not an exact science. There are no definitive models. Nehru was one kind of leader, the Prime Minister was another kind of leader, Mr. Vajpayee was a third kind of leader. But in all these leadership styles, there is something that you can pick, there is something that you can choose, there is something that you can emulate, or there is something you can simply absorb. So that is, the beauty of leadership. It is also not about merely the straight and narrow. It's not just a matter of being a good boy, making the right choices, working hard, and it doesn't happen that way. In fact, one of the earliest lessons that you learn in leadership is that life is not fair. You learn to live with that. And the sooner you learn to live with it, you will become a better leader. At every stage, there are difficult choices, moral, professional, judgmental. We all make those choices. But what you become as a leader is a consequence of those choices. So those choices are extremely important. This is what makes leadership perhaps so interesting. So with that very lengthy preamble, let me explain why I was so delighted when Mr. Srirang and his team reached out to me. I grabbed the opportunity. Let me also say that Mr. Srirang fulfills a very critical function, HR. It defines organizations. I know it defines the army. I'm in an organization today, UPSC, where we do this on a day-to-day basis. You pick talent, pick the right man for the job, pick people for their services. It is such an important thing. I was planning to come to it later, but just let me kill it here. In terms of statecraft, we were just discussing over breakfast, what India really needs to do in terms of leadership, and that is at the larger level, is to move from this recruitment model to a model for talent hunting, for a model for talent retention, because talent matters. I'll commend a book to you by Ian Easton about China's global strategy and see what the Chinese are doing. And I'll quote China many times, not because I admire them as a country. I mean, I know what they are. They're communists. But there's a lot to learn from them. And we must just study them so that we can learn and emulate. So this is what Z says. Now look at the clarity. He says the contest between superpowers is primarily a contest for talent. He says without talent, it is like having a tree with no roots and a fountain with no water. This is the typical Chinese saying. But does he end at that? Their 1,000 talents plan is a plan which was structured between the CCP and the PLA. And here the PLA has to be understood in a very different sense. It's not a typical army. It drives almost everything within the Chinese system. So it drives economics, commerce, the military. So in that sense, it's a very powerful organization. And what is the objective of that 1,000 talent plan? I mean, I read it 4 times to see, have I got it wrong? It says to get geniuses from all over the world. Now, can the UPSC say that our objective is to get geniuses from all over the world? We'll be laughed at. But they are so explicit about it. Do they stop at that? No. They are picking Nobel laureates. And I just got those names so that I've just jotted those names down so that you don't think I'm fibbing. Dr. Fran Chen Ning Yang. Now, the name is not important. They are all as unpronounceable as ever. But he's a Nobel laureate in physics. And he's been picked by the Chinese to drive their program. Civil military. They don't talk military civil. They talk civil military fusion. Artificial intelligence ka istemal in missiles and in everything else. Dr. Andrew Chi Yao, winner of the A.M. Turing Award. Who's A.M. Turing? Father of artificial intelligence. He's a master in coding. Now, when you are competing nationally with a country which is recruiting talent in this manner, you have to transform. I mean, HR has to become a very great function. And that talent will get you a different kind of leadership. And this is a communist country, by the way, which speaks of equity and all that. But look at how fierce they are in their competition. How they are valuing talent. And in consequence, what are the Americans doing? Israelis. So the Israelis have, these 2-3 typical units which do all their great work in space, cyber, and the strategic military stuff, but also in the civil domain. 8200, 9300, 82. You know how they recruit their people? They identify talent at the high school stage. And they are brought into these units. They have a military facade, but they are startups. You walk into them, their whole culture is one of startups. Aapko lagta hi nahi ki you got into a spit and polish military organization. And there are no bars. You can serve for 3 months, 4 years, 9 years, lifelong. Not like the army, you come in now 20 years, we won't let you go. They're so flexible in their recruitment models, but with a purpose. Now these guys who leave, so you leave and you go to the Silicon Valley or you go somebody else, there's a lifelong connect. So you exchange ideas, you exchange everything. And which is with this cross-pollination, with these kind of flows, 8200, 9300 and all are delivering the best technologies in space, in cyber, all the emerging domains. And the biggest thing, the advantage there is, in India it is these sharp distinctions between classroom and practice. 16 hours of syllabus and endless true and false and match the following, dazzle you academically. There they will take you to ongoing projects. So if the Israelis are working on the Stuxnet, the cyber attack on the Iranian nuclear reactor, these boys and girls work on those projects. As a result of which today, after so many decades, a graduate from these units is picked up like this. He perhaps is sought after more than a Stanford graduate. And it leads to real life outcomes both in the military and civilian spaces. So look at how these divides have gone. There is nothing civil, there is nothing military. All silos have collapsed. It is talent of every kind, talent in uniform, talent from the civil space. They are all coming together in these countries like Israel, China, in consequence in USA. The US Army has realized that mediocrity will not do. So they have structured a US Army Futures Command, which is located in Carnegie Mellon, which drives AI. In that Futures Command, the number 2 is not a 3-star, the number 1 is a 4-star, the number 3 is an academic. Top 3,000 academic hires, all kinds of minds. You walk into the Pentagon, you will find civil servants, you will find strategic affairs experts, you will find economists, technologists. So that's the way this game is going in terms of, talent and leadership. And I think India also will need to step up. So let me also say that to an audience as seasoned and accomplished as this, I cannot possibly be teaching or lecturing on leadership. I cannot tell you how to make successful careers in banking and finance. You know that better than me. So I would like to set this up as a wide-angled conversation on leadership. I made some remarks like I have done. I'll make some more points, share some thoughts, articulate my experiences, make some observations, offer a few suggestions. That should stir some thoughts within you, and we'll try and complete the cycle in the question-answer process. May I also say that a large part of what I say will, of course, be in a military setting and culture, because that is what I have spent 44 years in. I mean, it will not go out of me. They may not be exactly relatable in your respective domains. They will not be a tight fit. You will have to adapt the precepts intelligently to your unique functional context and to your own genius. It worked for me, as I said, and see if it works for you. May I also say this, that leadership, there are 2-3 aspects of leadership. There are some fundamental attributes that don't change. Honesty, this, that, and the other. But there are the deeper nuances. So the deeper nuances for the military, for the Army, Navy, Air Force will be very different from what they are for you. But genius in leadership lies in juxtaposing the fundamental attributes with the deeper nuances. The fundamental attributes don't change, as also calibrating the constants with the metrics of change. There are some attributes which simply don't change over time, and we will discover them. Now, this is how, since I've got 80 minutes, that's quite a luxury. I'll speak about leadership in terms of these 10 postulates. So I shall try and firstly, make some points about establishing the broad tenets of leadership in my view. That will be the first postulate. Second will be, the critical importance of personal probity. And I would like to labor this because many leaders, ruined their forays in leadership because of this point, straying from this. And this is something that you must guard. Also, in a competitive environment, moment you expose yourself to vulnerabilities, I can guarantee you your adversary will catch you on this. So it's not only a moral standpoint, it's from the competitive point. Don't expose yourself in any way by, indulging in this. If you do this, you might as well not be a leader. It's futile. You'll be wasting your time. I would like to differentiate this aspect between schooling, education, knowledge, and wisdom. It's my view that leadership is ultimately wisdom, what we call in Hindi Vivek. It's as simple as that. The power to discriminate between right and wrong, between this choice and that choice, that is leadership. And we get these choices in our life every day, sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously, sometimes 4 years later you realize, oh, I took that choice, I'm paying a consequence, or I'm profiting from that choice. So it's about that. It's a tale of evolution, granular refinement, and value additions. And if you make it constantly, somehow subconsciously, I can guarantee you that you will grow as a leader. As they say in Hindi or in Hindustani, ye barikiyon ka mudda hai. It's a very refined issue. The fourth postulate, in my view, is that leadership must always be lofty. You can be a major, but you can have lofty goals. You can be a general and you can think like a sergeant. So there's certain loftiness is very important, but it must obviously be combined with the practical everyday kind of stuff. Now that is an art, as we say in the armed forces, to calibrate your strategy and your tactics. Both are important. I'll give you a very good example. So those who say that strategy is not important, so I'm just making the contrary argument. So they say that strategy without tactics, and please don't switch off, it's nothing very complicated, it's just military jargon. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. But tactics without strategy is simply the noise before defeat. Now take it to Iraq and Afghanistan. You got your tactics was all wonderful, but since the strategy was wrong, 20 years of futile fighting. Noise before defeat. And ultimately this very shameful pullout of this great power from Afghanistan. Has it happened by coincidence? There's a lovely book by Thomas Ricks on generalship. That's the only book I read on generalship. And trust an American to critique their generals. In India, thankfully, nobody dares. But one of you must write this book on generalship. There, look at this point that he makes, that after Vietnam, the Americans carried out a wholesome review of what went wrong in their system. So there was something wrong with training, there was something wrong with the NCOs, there was something wrong with the politico-military relationship, the politicians took wrong decisions. But they concluded that the generals were perfect. And that's an internal army study, so that was the conclusion. And in that conclusion, a fierce debate crops up between the then army chief and their boss of TRADOC, which is army equivalent to our army training command. And the TRADOC boss says that, listen, we need to change our whole PME training pattern to develop leaders with this wider strategic vision. And the chief says, no, I just want 100 good battalion commanders. 100 good battalion commanders. Or actually, it's a three-pillared debate between the TRADOC boss, the boss of their Army War College, and the chief. And I don't know which, but what the critical cog, one of them, unfortunately has cancer. The one who's arguing ki strategy bhi hona chahiye. So those who argue for, good things in life, they always perish. That's also the lesson. So this chap unfortunately has cancer and the chief wins. But to America's misfortune, all the generals, these 100 good battalion commanders, do very well as battalion commanders, brigade commanders, and I can name them. Peter Pace, you go and see now, go on the net. He was the chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he's called Pete the Parrot, because all he would do was parrot what Rumsfeld said. Good battalion commander, but no strategic vision. Peter Pace, Tommy Franks, and they are the leaders at the strategic level when America is in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's a connect between all this. So if you de-emphasize strategy, if you de-emphasize big thinking, you will get this. So this is, why you always a bit of these lofty goals are extremely important. Then we'll talk of the salience of communication, stories, narratives. I think that's a very important issue in leadership. Postulate 6, the small point that I wish to make is that the Indian Army is not a perfect organization. We have a lot of flaws, but we have a very rich tapestry in military leadership. And it's just not about gallantry and all. That's pretty obvious. Vikram Batra and all that is known. There are some other aspects of army leadership which I would just like to, bring to your attention. We'll discuss some other profiles of leadership which are equally fascinating in terms of learning value, inspiration, and emulation. Leadership of thought and change. This is extremely important because every organization will perish if you don't think and you don't change. And so we have these day-to-day stewards in leadership, and you have these visionary leaders. These visionary leaders who can transform and change. Postulate 9 and 10 are my two private conclusions. I will just share them with you for whatever they are worth. And in the end, if we have time, I'd like to squeeze in this bit of, extraordinary leaders. Now, they are in a very different genre, something like Elon Musk. He fascinates me greatly. I'm sure many of you would have read about him. I'll just try and bring up two issues. So there are so many domains in leadership, so challenging. So you can be the day-to-day steward, you can be the visionary, or you can be Elon Musk, creative, innovative, chaotic, and at times destructive. But it is out of destruction that so much good happens. So, this is how huge this whole canvas is. So now the first point, about leadership. As I said before, I would urge that we take a wide-angle view of leadership. Personal attributes are extremely important, but for an audience like this, I think that will be too elementary. So basic attributes of hard work, sincerity, diligence, all that kind of stuff is a given. But it is more useful always to study leadership in real-life settings, context of events of a certain time and era. It is only that complete picture which will give you Churchill in the World War II setting, will give you exposure to a certain kind of leadership. So when you do that, various facets of leadership will come to life. Leadership in crisis, leadership of thought, leadership of change. Today, what India needs is technological leadership. This whole competition with China, and may I tell you, it's grim, is one of technological leadership. Let's just a moment on this crisis. There could be no better nursery for honing leadership skills than pure, unadulterated adversity. The sooner you get it in life, the better you for a leader. And I can tell you this out of experience. It is only the test of fire, as we all know, that makes fine steel. The best example is Winston Churchill. So Winston Churchill's career sketches roughly from 1900 to 1945. From 1900 to 1939, he was a complete disaster. In everything that he did, he was a Lord of the Admiralty, he was a minister here, something there. He was a huge disappointment. Somebody has tabulated this, that 86% of his productive life was spent in nursing failures. That was the amount of adversity. So he himself, Winston Churchill, said that successful leadership is the ability to move from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. Now, I'm not saying that you all become Churchills, may none of that misery come on you, I'm not saying that. But in terms of this point that I'm making, see, this is what Robert James, who wrote a book on Churchill in the pre-war years, what was it captioned? Pre-war years, a study in failure. And it is this Churchill who leads Britain through moments of profound despair and hopelessness. Those books that he's written on history, actually, they won the Nobel Prize for Literature because he had felt those things on his own. And from this hopelessness, he leads Britain to glittering triumph. And some of us, of that generation have heard these memorable phrases, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, sweat and tears. In a certain phase, that was leadership. Coming clean with your countrymen. Tributes to the Royal Air Force. Never in the field of human endeavor have so many owed so much to so few. When those RAF pilots were defending the skies of Britain, these were moments of deep despair. Edward Murrow from the CBS, and this is another, communications. He says, Churchill, the great communicator, took the English language and mobilized and sent it into battle. It was the English language and the great communications. So two lessons from Churchill, crisis and communications, thought and change. I'm paraphrasing the Prime Minister at the Combined Commanders Conference abroad, the INS Vikramaditya. He's telling military leaders, we've had many good field commanders, great valor, but we need a different kind of leaders. We need thought leaders who can drive change through the national security system. Now, that's very rare for an army. But that's the moment. The Chief of Defence Staff today, his principal challenge is to drive change to the national security system. He's not going to fight those battles on the LAC. Not physically. And that's a humongous challenge of getting together these disparate point of views, disparate organizations, schooled in a certain way of thinking and bringing about change. But if that change doesn't come, our national security system will falter. So thought of leadership, of thought and change. Financial histories. I'm nobody on matters of finance, but I quoted Neil Ferguson to you. Read his book, The Ascent of Money. I read it in parts, A Financial History of the World. It says that the financial history is the essential backstory behind all history. Financial history. Why financial failure took Argentina down from the world's sixth richest country to an inflation-ridden basket. How financial revolution powered China to its current perch in the global pecking order. Its finances, of course, a lot of other stuff. And why sooner or later every bubble bursts. Thomas Piketty, French economist, his magnum opus on capital in the 21st century. This, whole analysis of accumulation of wealth, growth, so on and so forth. Now, for somebody like me, it makes sense only in bits and parts, but it does hold my attention, so I'm sure it will resonate greatly with you. So both history and the big picture are important. But somebody in the ICI should say, why should I read this? I'll tell you why, in my view, because by reading these signs early, at least, at the highest leadership, you can shepherd your organization to make early strategic adjustments to the big changes that could follow. Fit your organizational outlook into the larger landscape of events. In my own personal career, let me tell you how it changed my life greatly. As a colonel, I was one of those guys, very diligent and making all the right notes and focusing on topping this examination, doing well there, this, that. Suddenly I discovered that, there was a lot more. And this was when I was doing the high defense management course. I just got put off by some of the instructors there and found them boring. And I just decided to read widely. And I found thereafter that in every professional event, everybody knew the ordinary stuff. Everybody was an expert on the ordinary stuff, but it was these bigger issues that you could pitch in. And sometimes it was these bigger issues which mattered most because your boss or your boss's boss was mandated to do that, and he could find nobody to do that. So it made absolute practical sense, and so I would strongly urge this wider reading. It really helps you. I'll relate it from my domain, you relate it to yours. As a good soldier, you will never excel at the tactical, operational and strategic levels unless you have a sound understanding of how your instrument of force is positioned in the larger calculus of your nation's statecraft. So it starts from there. The positioning of the military. If you have that larger organization, you will always do that squad and company bit well. But if you do not have that and that larger understanding will not happen one night. It is not that, you suddenly become a lieutenant general, you put the button on and strategy will flow. It has to grow over these years, and therefore I'm a strong advocate of this. Leadership of institution building. There's this famous quote of Bertrand Russell. Why institutions must build leaders. In the beginning, he says, institutions mold character. Then character transforms institutions. Now, it doesn't happen visibly. It doesn't happen over 1 or 2 years. I mean, the contribution of people like Sam Manekshaw, Sagat Singh, General B.C. Joshi, though he lived for, have been transformational in the army. They have really built these institutions, and I can tell you with, day-to-day incidents. So leadership is a continuum of formidable challenges, of great successes, unfinished tasks. Leadership is also the ability to pass the baton gracefully. There comes a time when you must realize that your chapter is closed, but if you're a skilled leader, you'll reinvent yourself in the next world. You'll keep reinventing yourself till you reach hell or heaven, wherever you do. But this passing the baton is very important. We were discussing General S.K. Sinha. He was somebody who was expected to be chief. Everybody thought he would. For some reason, he was not appointed. He was not bitter about it. Just go back to his videos of those days, leadership was, and therefore, he rose in status because he did not become chief. He went on to become governor of, governor of Assam and then ambassador to Nepal. But, he flowered there. In Henry Kissinger, he says that there is this book of his on leadership. It's a thick book. It's pretty, intimidating. But just let it in your room and pick it up gradually. He's analyzed, these 6 distinctive strategies of statecraft, a product of the leader's personal attributes, his predilections modified in terms of the geostrategic challenges of those times, practical situations, roadblocks and upheavals, to discover these unique 6 strategies. He calls them the strategies of humility, will, equilibrium, transcendence that is going beyond the normal, conviction and excellence. Now what is this? I'll just tell you very briefly, only with one. So the first is Konrad Adenauer. Many of us would not have heard about him. I had not heard about him till I picked up the book. So who was he? He was the leader of this post-World War II Germany, a defeated and morally bankrupt Germany. See, a Germany who had to overcome the stigmas of Nazism, Hitler, brutal aggression. And he brings Germany back into the Committee of Nations. Within 3 decades, makes it this great engineering power. Now see, from the depths of where Germany was, I mean, you had lost your moral compass. Nazism re-establishes relations with Israel after all that Holocaust and the persecution of the Jews. And he calls it the strategy of humility. So you must know when you need to be humble. You need to be humble in the context of your nation. And I cannot capture that for you unless you go through that yourself. He lays the basis for the renewal of the German people. Their whole, unka pura jo wajood tha mit gaya tha. They were kind of shamed. They felt shamed to what they had done. There were food shortages, inflation, infant mortality worse than Africa. And he raises Germany from the ruins of that disintegration and destruction, restore civil order. Germany was steeped in these narrow nationalities. He has to tell them that the future lies in an integrated Europe. He lays the basis for the Europe Union, which is an equivalent of the United States of America, almost in terms of an engine of growth. So please read that, and he gives them a new national identity. He overcomes the Soviet challenge. He steers Germany through the Berlin crisis, that. He calls it the strategy of humility. Strategy of will, de Gaulle, who rebuilds the political structure of France, defeated, demoralized, prospective into this prosperous nation of the 20th century. Richard Nixon, Anwar Sadat, who transcends hostility in the Middle East, to bring about peace to the Middle East. Margaret Thatcher, UK was the sick man of Europe. She improves its international position greatly through the strategy of conviction. And the last is Lee Kuan Yew. Now, the Lee Kuan Yew, of course, we know is the Prime Minister of Singapore. Our Prime Minister is a big fan of his. Xi is a big fan of his. That is the reason why we should study Lee Kuan Yew. Xi has been studying him for years. Lee Kuan Yew, realized that Singapore has no resources. It has no resources. So he said he will take the humans in that nation and make them products of excellence. and it's called the strategy of excellence. See, it's something to ponder over. India has so many strategic threats, great strategic adversity. But the think tanks who are analyzing India are in Singapore. Excellence, RSIS. We should be having the Shangri-La dialogue, but the Shangri-La dialogue is held in Singapore. So he has taken on a nation with no resources, not even the same threats, and made them, these international centers where people gather and confer on issues of such strategic military importance. And of course, how he has transformed the city and all. Now, why these leaders are important, they did it in a different domain. But if you study these essays in leadership, they will stay in your mind, and when your own organizations and your lives, these challenges come, you take it from me, there will be a subconscious recall. There will be a subconscious recall, and it will give you some sense of how to navigate these challenges. And therefore, he also makes this very important point. He says, leaders think and act at the intersection of two axes. It's very obvious. The past and the future, the abiding values of the organization, which can sometimes be dogmas, and their aspirations. And he says leaders must know that must balance what is necessarily drawn from the past, so a deep understanding of history, with what they intuit about the future. But if your historical understanding is good, if your knowledge of your organization is good, you will intuit about the future far better. And it is this intuitive grasp of direction that enables leaders to set objectives and lay down a strategy. In so doing, leaders help in the realization of organizational and institutional objectives, and that is leadership. That's a good way to understand leadership. How you take the past, intuit about the future. How you take what are the values, existing values, maybe dogmas, and convert them into more productive aspirations for the organization. If you think this is unimportant, just think of Europe before World War I. Europe at the turn of the 20th century, it was at the peak of its global influence. Its progress was destined to be unending. Its population and economies were growing at unprecedented rates. Industrialization and free trade had midwife prosperity. The English journalist Norman Angell, in the book The Great Illusion, concluded that growing independence amongst European powers had rendered war prohibitively inexpensive and exceedingly unlikely. Look at the conclusion. Prohibitively India में भी ये बात हो रही थी. 5-6 साल पहले people would say, General साहब, अब लड़ाई नहीं होने वाली. What they failed to understand was, लड़ाई तो हमेशा होगी. Humans are made like that. लड़ाई का स्वरूप बदल रहा था. So the changing character of war was, construed. But look at the mistake that Europe makes. These grand conclusions, First World War happens. It exhausts treasuries, terminates dynasties, shatters lives. 1918, 10 million soldiers killed, 7 million civilians killed. And that whole thing goes into the Second World War, 60 million killed. Cities from Cologne to Coventry to Nanjing and Nagasaki, worldwide, are reduced to rubble. German legitimacy is destroyed by Adolf Hitler. France, the Third Republic collapses. You have a bankrupt England signaling the end of Great Britain as a great empire. And what does this all flow from? Those fallacious conclusions that, we were at prosperity. And this is why that first point that Kissinger makes is so important, balancing the axis, history. And by the way, Kissinger in his book on China, in his last chapter, he has said that China will go to war. I am not warmongering, but Church said it. Do read this. And now look at the Europe of recent times, just before Ukraine. It is a simple failure to link the axis of the past with intuitions about the future. The great Angela Merkel thought that energy dependencies had inured Germany to war. That we are so energy dependent that Putin will not attack. And see what has happened. NATO, I know, was this organization which everybody else, the Americans said, they called it the GIs called it no action, talk only. Because when they would operate with them in Iraq, Afghanistan, they would say, we don't patrol by night. So if you don't patrol by night, what a military organization are you? You get up, patrol by day. And they thought they were smart. Europe thought that they were smart. Why get into all this when you were prospering? Their economies were growing. Ask them today. Berlin is fearful that Putin might step in there only 30 kilometers. Poland is nervous. Suddenly, Germany has doubled its defense budget. Japan has overcome its war guilt. Please, generals are often mistaken for warmongering. I'm certainly not doing that. I'm just pointing to you why we must be constantly vigilant and constantly, look at history and the future. And similar, shall we say, evidences are there of the smaller variety in our own organization. We should not discount them because, you never know what happens. In leadership, it points to the futility of echo chambers. Guard against echo chambers. And a leader must do that. Respect discerning views. Respect contrarian views. This is the abiding lesson of leadership. And one has seen this so many times, I'm sure as you have. There's that lovely saying, there's that saying that the respect of those that you respect is worth more than the applause of the multitude. ये सोशल मीडिया के ज़माने में बहुत ज़रूरी है. These likes, shikes and all which we get carried away by, they may not necessarily be discerning views. So we must always search and read a lot of biographies, autobiographies, good books, journals, because as I said, they will get embedded in your subconscious mind, and especially the younger generation amongst you, because we must acknowledge, in our times we read because there was nothing else to do. So a magazine would lie, you were forced to pick it up, the newspaper would lie, and we used to fight. Because of boredom, we had these very miserly fathers. There would be one newspaper, and first the grand old man would read it from 9 to 11. At 11, the sports page would come. One newspaper was shared. Some grand sense of economy we had. Anyway, but so that was it. Aajkal, there are so many distractions. You don't need to read the newspaper. I, who was so fond of reading, over the last 4 months, I watch YouTube. I have not picked up a newspaper, I must confess. Not a good thing to say. But there's so much of news flowing, and there's so many distractions. But what you get from a book is extremely important. Not because you just quote from the book, because you read that whole thing in its entirety. You get the whole circumstance. You get the contrarian narratives. It's very important to get a sense of that, because only then will you make the right decisions in leadership. I've told you about this free mantle. Also, it is very important today, I see many of us tend to flow with the wind. Trust your hunches. Believe in yourself. When you think you're right, close your ears to the howling mob. This is also a very important trait in leadership. I've seen many good chaps collapsing just because they chose to, flow with the... And very often, as you grow in life, you will find that your hunch is right, and the other guy's hunch was wrong. So you also have to, learn to believe in it. In this part, if I have to define leadership, I may be wrong. I would define leadership, I would posit it as wisdom or vivek, a very sophisticated ability to discriminate. It is astuteness. It does not necessarily come from schooling. Kamraj, Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, President of the Indian National Congress, didn't go to school. He had no formal education. So it does necessarily not come from school. In fact, in my view, this is a mature audience. I think Mark Twain said, when he was asked that why was he reasonably successful in life, he said, I took great care never to let my schooling interfere with my education. That is also my conclusion. Those school years are, with due respect to all my teachers, pretty wasteful. The education starts later. And of course, if there is that right mix of schooling and education, it flows into wisdom. And then you become this astute leader. Astute leader is a very complicated thing. He's not somebody who's in your face, who's always opposing, who you think is actually this dashing leader. But he quietly knows what is right. He doesn't make a public, and you will get to know one day, because you don't judge him over 2 years, you will judge him over 40 years, and you will know that this man was right. So it's not about a very public posturing, that I stood up to him and I stood up to him. But you can signal in very discreet ways that, listen, I'm not up for this. This is this astuteness. It is a very fine set of attributes, the fusion of humility, intelligence, diligence, knowledge, experience, a sense of timing, political savvy. You may say the army guy talking of politics. Let me tell you what Manekshaw said when he was asked about apoliticality. He said, listen, we are deeply politically conscious, but we are consciously not politically committed. And that's a very elevated virtue. That I understand your politics, but it's a conscious decision that I will never dabble in it. And see, it's so wise. Look at Pakistan today. All kinds of reasons are given. I'm no expert on Pakistan and why Pakistan has, got itself into this morass. So some people say the idea was wrong. I say that even if the idea was wrong, what has made it unworkable is its skewed civil-military relationship. Today the Pakistan army is realizing it. There was no wisdom in that power. Bajwa is getting abused. Corps commanders are getting abused. I never had, on the LAC and all, they would taunt us. They would open fire at the drop of a hat and they would tell us, yaar, tum jaake na, abhi so jao. Tumhara order aayega 4 din baad. So we felt this civil control was, but look at the wisdom of civil military control. That overriding principle of Peter Fever of civil military control is that a civilian, the political principle, the civilian is right even when he is wrong. The civilian has a right to be wrong. Now once that debate is settled, and as democracies evolve, and this whole stuff, these fears go, the civil military fuse to great effect. That's what's happening in USA and Israel and all that. And this is, Pakistan is dead because it didn't get its civil military relationship right. A small thing it didn't get right. The hubris of those generals, some of them was well intentioned. Asif Nawaz was once asked by a journalist of, how he had become Nawaz's man and this and that. And he said, young lady, when 500,000 people move at the wag of your finger, you are nobody's man but of your own conscience. Now, I'm not saying the Pakistan army was bad intention. They said we have such a superior conscience, but look what it has come to. It has destroyed institutions. So it is these, small decisions. In our case, I would say, and I gave you Manekshaw's example. Mr. Arun Jaitley, when he was in the opposition, he had come to the National Defence College and he was speaking and somebody asked him a question on leadership, on some politically loaded question. And he said, listen, anywhere else I would have answered it differently. Here I'm answering it like this because I'm in an army, meaning that he could have been far more offensive, but he chose to be discreet. So when I look back now, if India has been mature in its civil-military relationship, it has been because of the grace of people like Arun Jaitley and the political class and the wisdom of people like Manekshaw. So leaders or these leadership traits thankfully converged in the manner that it did. So the country, it is far better off. A sound leader has a certain gravitas about him. What in Hindi they call therav. There is a certain, he's not jumpy. There is a certain depth to him. As a leader, don't be an echo, be the voice. Read widely, as I said, observe carefully, never be a bhakt. Listen to a wide range of opinions, embrace versatility, grow your own repertoire of thoughts, views and ideas, and believe me, in time you will find your own unique genius. It is an original exercise. You have to do it and you will discover your own voice. You will find the time in your career when people start recognizing you as a leader. You will feel it, that they trust you. You make an impact. Be original. That is one thing. You cannot, I have quoted so many people, but I cannot be Churchill. I cannot be Manekshaw. I don't have the swagger of Manekshaw. Why should I pretend to be Manekshaw? So all this kind of originality, distinctiveness makes you stand out in the room is also in life. And see, I'm in the UPSC and all, we interview so many people. You can make out in 5 minutes that there is something distinct about this person. The way he speaks, there is a conviction in his voice. There is something about his demeanor. And then you engage with him, you question him deeply, and you discover that this person is superior. So break stereotypes. For example, we have this in the army. Thinking general. What bloody general if you can't think? I mean, what is this kind of general? Thinking general, non-thinking general. I have someone else. Scholar, warrior. Damn it. These skills come together. They're all-round skills. How can you be a warrior and not be a scholar? I somehow never got it. But these cliches dominate. दिमाग के बाल कभी सफेद नहीं होने चाहिए. सर के बाल चाहे सफेद हो जाए. I don't know whom I'm quoting this, but it's a very diplomacy and tact are important, but do not conflate the same with not having a definite view, taking a position. In trying to walk the tightrope, do not fall between two stools. So many of us do so often. As General Sundarji said, do not ever become orderless, colorless, tasteless. A lot of people take pride in this. Let me tell you, some of them are my good friends and they tell me, this pays in life, maybe. But I would not advise that. Do not be orderless, colorless, tasteless. Think big, but make sure that your feet are always firmly implanted on the ground. Combine a lofty, purposeful vision with a certain groundedness in behavior and steely resolve. I have been talking about thinking big, but I can tell you, always pay careful attention to minutiae. Remember that both the God and devil lie in the details. Bhagwan बारीकियों में है. All the biggest projects are destroyed because of lack of attention to detail. This point about thinking big. So नजरें आसमान पर, लेकिन पैर हमेशा ज़मीन पर. It's a good way. Another way of leadership is to get these couplets and these poetic verses as kind of inspiring virtues or even as cautionary alarms. They will remind you periodically कि यार ये करो ये मत करो. This leadership is an amalgam of talent, character and industry. Meritocracy. I want to make this point about meritocracy because I think it's a serious deficiency in India, not because we are malintentioned, because we don't realize the value of merit. So somebody says that the most meritocratic organization in the world, can anybody guess what is it? Organization in the world, meritocratic, is the Chinese Communist Party. It may be an authoritarian organization, but it is the most meritocratic. I'm told Xi has got into the Chinese Communist Party on his 10th or 11th attempt. He was rejected 10 times. Can you imagine this powerful leader of China? Kishore Mehbubani says that if you meet a Chinese diplomat today in a Western capital, he would have read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chinese newspapers, the Global Times, and he would speak 3 languages. And the lazy Trump appointee would not even have read the New York Times. If America is declining, it is because meritocracy is declining. I've told you all this about Ian Easton. Now, how important is industry? Hard work. Malcolm Gladwell wrote this book, Outliers, the story of success. In our generation, it was quite a rage and many people have read it. So there's this instance of the Berlin's elite academy of music. In the 1990s, they divided these violinists into 3 groups. The stars, who were the world-class players of the violin, the good and the average. The average were unlikely to ever play professionally. And they start at 5. And after a while, all these 3 groups, they practice for about 3 hours per week. At 8, the differences in the hours of practice begin to emerge. And the conclusion at 20 is that the stars were all those who had practiced for 10,000 hours, the good was 6,000 hours, and the average were 3,000 hours. So, those of us who are talented, many of us who are talented think, yaar, mera to talent hi sab kuch hai. Remember this. A good example is Tendulkar and Vinod Kamli. Vinod Kamli was this very talented cricketer. People said he saw the ball. Although the India Today columnists have a very nice way of putting it, कि 10 सेकंड पहले उसको बॉल दिख जाती है और वो ऐसे हाई एंड कोऑर्डिनेशन है. And see what happened to Kamli and where did Tendulkar go? Hard work. I recall, I've heard this or read this or seen this or some video, Nafisa Ali narrating that when she was shooting for Major Sahab with Amitabh Bachchan, Major Sahab. So she says one day she walks into the set and the shot is at 10 o'clock. So she walks it at 9:45 and she thinks she just go through her line and be ready. And from the corner of the eye, she notices Amitabh Bachchan. So she just asks that makeup man, कि बच्चन साहब कब आए? So he tells her कि मैडम वो तो 7 बजे आए हैं और कम से कम 16 टेक कर चुके हैं. So when he appears so effortless, which is actually a great deal of effort. So all these effortless characters are very hardworking. So when you have to choose between talent, character and industry, I would just like to, underline the importance of industry. Beware of all these, false contradictions. As I said, action and thought. A good quote is, think like a man of action, act like a man of thought. Also this very sharp distinction, particularly in India, and there's a very good quote for this. A nation that draws a sharp distinction between its soldiers and its scholars will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. You just can't have these silly distinctions. Draw sensibly on your civilizational wisdom. I would very strongly urge this. In our system of education, people like me, that part has got de-emphasized. It's coming very late in life. The Chinese didn't make this mistake. They adapted the best from Western practices. I know in warfare they've done it. Read people like Andrew Marshall, all these Western writers. But they never lost the wisdom of Sun Tzu and Confucius. In fact, this whole peaceful rise is an elaborate exercise in strategic deception which flows from Sun Tzu. The Chinese have fooled the world into thinking, they told them straight, and there's a lot of evidence now, you read Michael Pillsbury and all, that listen, give us weapons, technology and money, and we will become a democracy like you. And the Americans believed it. Kissinger believed it. Nixon has, in the later years, wrote, I have created a Frankenstein monster. Now, I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but if you have to fool people also, there is so much thinking behind it. And to sustain it for 40 years, in our case, see what has happened. I always notice these distinctions which have been drawn between government, private sector, abhi tak hain. Now, our texts tell us what is the sensible thing to do. So use Saraswati to write, publish, prosper, patent, and that Saraswati will create Lakshmi. It will create wealth. And that wealth should nourish instruments of power. And ultimately it is that Durga which also protects you. So there has to be a sensible fusion between, as simple as that, between Saraswati, Lakshmi and Durga. But what happened in our political journey, and once again, see, I'm not making a political point, it's just a historical fact, so it must be, in my view, highlighted because it has affected us. Mr. Tata goes to Mr. Nehru at some time, and I think it's in the context of a conversation about Air India and making it more efficient, and he says, Mr. Prime Minister, I have to make profits. And Mr. Nehru, who was very fond of J.R.D. Tata, he was his favorite, says, J.R.D., don't utter that dirty word. Looks the other way, signaling him for him to go out. Now see what you signaled to the instrument of Lakshmi. Sometime in the 1950s, Fareed Zakaria tells us in the post-American world, Mr. Nehru strays into the MOD and finds people in uniform in the MOD and flies into a rage. Zakaria, who's been educated in the West where military is very much a part of the Pentagon, he says, if you don't find military officers in the Ministry of Defense, where will they be in the Ministry of Agriculture? But Mr. Nehru was so valid reasons of those days, coups and all. But look at the message that you send out to the instrument of force. And what do people around you buy? That, listen, it is only the government that is important. Lakshmi is not important. Profit is not important. And power is not important. And that fashioned the India of those times because of, what shall I say, I'm not making a point only about Mr. Nehru, but this was the wisdom of those times. Keep the military away. We grew into these silos, even as the world was moving towards fusing the productive outcomes of all these. And civil-military fusion is a practiced philosophy. So sometimes it is these traits in leadership or these traits in our thinking, which are so. Also, please remember that good leaders understand that what seems inevitable becomes so by human agency. Please just listen to this. If you resign yourself to the status quo shall indeed prevail. So that is also a function of the leaders that matter, therefore, transcend the circumstances that they inherit and carry their organizations, institutions, societies or nations to the frontiers of the possible. Now this applies to nations, to institutions, to smaller organizations. Next one is this, probity bit. Here I will just like to make, one point. As I said, life is full of temptations, many seductions that could off-ramp your journey. Set some poetic alarms to your life, verses, quotes, incidents, stories that help you make the right choices. Guardrail your life's journey. We are all humans. But make sure, lest these become fateful distractions in the larger purpose of your leadership objectives. There's this lovely thing about Akbar and Birbal. Birbal was one of those rare Hindu courtiers in a predominantly Mughal court. And it is said, why did Akbar want him there? Because Akbar valued him greatly, not because of his elegant repartee, but also his ability to speak truth to power. He often deliberately punctured the emperor's ego. He brought him down to Mother Earth by telling him, कि शहनशाह तुमसे पहले जो शख्स यहाँ नदीम था, उसे भी अपना खुदा होने का यकीन था. Every man thinks that he's great. At every stage, please set these alarms. As a battalion commander, I can relate from my life as a brigade command. You grow in stature, the pomp and the circumstance carries you away. 6 chaps standing there, this batti here, that batti there, and that has caused the ruin of so many. So some kind of conscious keeping is very important. A sensible wife and rebellious children often do a good job. I am extremely grateful to my wife because she never fails to puncture my ego at least 3 times a day. When my sisters are around me, that goes to 6. It's so important. Also, see, it's not a matter that you can laugh away because these are very important choices. And this quote from Rahim puts it best. There are hard choices, harder right, easier wrong, not easy to make. He says, Rahman mushkil aa padi, tedhe dohu kaam. You would have heard of this in our school days. Rahman mushkil aa padi, tedhe dohu kaam. Seedhe se jag na mile, material pleasures, but tedhe se na mile Ram. So you take those material pleasures and Ram will catch you. CBI or somebody will catch you. These are very difficult choices. But now sit back and see, what should you do? It will tell you, ki yaar seedhe chalo. Because that other thing is worse. I am not giving a moral argument for being this. I am saying it is the only way to survive. It is the only way to grow in leadership. Honesty and probity are also a strategic advantage, not merely a moral persuasion. And see, once again, please don't think I'm making a political point, but you see somebody like the Prime Minister. Today, even when he makes mistakes, say if you have a view on demonetization, this, that political capital, that trust is so much that it holds because of that respect for honesty. That respect. Now, even if you have differences with him, do just consider this. It is a strategic advantage. There is no more political persuasion, and so many others, perhaps Kamraj and all. So this is the point. Be ambitious, and I'm extremely ambitious. Be objective seeking, embrace winning ways, but also learn to be content. I think it is Javed Akhtar who said this beautifully. He says, "Khushi se fasla sirf ek kadam hai. हर घर में बस एक ही कमरा कम है." It is always that one room that is always short, and you think यार ये एक कमरा बन जाए, इसके बाद नहीं करूंगा, but उसी में पकड़े जाते हो. तो एक कमरा छोड़ दो. This is my ultimately, and let me also say this, and from an army organization I'm telling you, where people think it is powered by the MIML and law, let me tell you, ultimately all authority is moral. Status have a very strong moral core. If that core dissolves, nothing will be left. And the best moral lecture is personal example. And this from an army organization where people think it is the danda that works. Let me tell you, it doesn't. It is these personal examples, these inspirations. Manekshaw at the fag end of his life was asked, Ki, what was your biggest contribution? Why are you so proud of the army? He says, I was magnanimous. He says, I have never in my life, I became a field marshal, I may have punished 3 or 4. And we think the army is all about punishment and this great MIML and the court martial and this, that. He says, when a file would come to me from the AG saying this man is guilty, I would say, go and have a look at it. A major general who came to him who was charged with corruption, and he asked him that, were you corrupt? He said, yes. In exasperation, Manekshaw said, go home and shoot yourself dead. I mean, that was but he didn't. I'm not making a point that you don't hold people accountable. But leadership is about these larger virtues. These are things that work. Somebody else has explained it in a very different way. Says in younger years, the moral challenges are relatively easy to navigate. It is analogous to the days of the Ramayana, where everything was very simple. So you studied hard, played hard, worked hard, and you did well. So he said, because humans were simpler human beings. So Dashrath wrongfully banishes Ram to the forests, Banvas. Ram upholds both the narrow rule and the larger dharma. Now this is very important in our context, the rule and the dharma. He says the narrow rule is the wishes of the monarch, and the larger dharma is the father-son relationship. So even when the father is wrong, he respects it, even when the decision was unfair. He says in later years, by the time the Mahabharata is written, humans have become crooked. So complexities, nuances exemplified in the Mahabharata kick in. And now there is this clever distinction between niyam and dharma. So he says the Pandavas lose the game of dice. Duryodhan upholds the narrow rule but violates the larger dharma. So because we have won the game of dice, everything that is yours is ours, not only the riches, also your women, leading to the disrobing of Draupadi. Yudhishthir is this straight and narrow guy who's struggling between rule and dharma. And this is the beauty of Krishna. Because Krishna is that elevated leader who bends the rules, interprets the rules to uphold the larger dharma. In our case, where we are stuck today is this worshipping of rules. And I'm referring this to, not only of government, increasingly I see in private sector, rule, process. We have to find a way to come out of this. The Chinese have done a study. Xi, when he came to power, he asked this guy Van Huming, one of his principal ideologues, a Harvard-educated guy, to do a study on the weaknesses of democracies. And the fourth point in that is the obsession of democracies with rules and processes. And it goes on to say, kill them in their own systems. So people are watching you. Your obsession with rules, with processes. Now I've heard the other arguments a lot, what will happen to us and all, but you just simply have to come out of it. So, in the context of what I said, it is, difficult. Not everybody can be Krishna. Krishna will be rare. But you, at a certain level in the organization, you have to be Krishnas. See, from the same rules, same GFR, same thing, look what Mr. Gadkari is doing. The same GFR, look at infrastructure. And same, or Mr. Vaishnav, so many others, same GFR, people will make excuses. So it is this battle. He says, don't become Duryodhan, upholding the narrow rule in violation of the larger dharma. Many of us are doing it. May not be ill-intentioned, but unconsciously. He says, at least try and be Yudhishthir, struggle to be Ram, uphold the dharma with the help of a Krishna. Now this is, some kind of complexity that we are stuck with. Look at this whole Atmanirbharta business. It is not just empty technological self-reliance. What is the Prime Minister saying? I'm paraphrasing him. He said, liberate the forces of innovation, energy and enterprise from the scourge of process and procedure. He says, your niyamo ka jaal bichha rakha hai. It has got created over years. In the next stage of India's evolutionary leadership, if we do not surmount this obstacle, we are a done case. We just have to do this. And this is, related to this whole business of the narrow rule and the larger dharma. Also look at this argument. There's a guy called Mr. Rajiv Malhotra, an Indian abroad, who writes very convincingly on these things. He says, all decisions cannot be on the basis of majority. The Chinese also make this point. When they are branding their system with the Americans, they say, listen, when you have a problem, what do? Your democracies. Every 5 years, you go to elections. They are the masses. They are not wise men. They are the masses. We go to our Politburo, the 9 most meritocratic men who have come through a system. We get this kind of decision. Now, this is their argument in branding. That's not the point. But the point that Rajiv Malhotra makes, he says decision making must now evolve to what in our text was called adhikar. Authority to the informed, the meritorious and the competent versus mindless democracy. Every decision cannot be, we say, numbers. Every decision cannot be to the masses. Masses are simply not informed. I am not informed to take decisions on finance and banking. You know it best. So this transition, from, while all the other aspects of democracy are important, freedoms, liberties of the West, all those are hugely important. But somehow we need, to this bit. Okay, next. The third is this distinction that I've already made between schooling, education, knowledge and wisdom. It is a matter of broadening education, also convergence. Leonardo da Vinci, Walter Isaacson has written a wonderful book on that painter. He says that when Leonardo da Vinci made that painting of Mona Lisa, वो painting कितनी चौड़ी हो या कितनी लंबी हो, he calculated with mathematical equations. And in that book, he has printed those equations. Each equation runs into pages. So it's fascinating कि हर लंबाई और चौड़ाई में उसने 6 पेज लगा दिए. But उसकी आंखों की चमक कैसी हो, what should the cheeks be like, what should be the facial disposition, came from Leonardo da Vinci's deep understanding of humanities. So true genius lies at the intersect of science and humanities. India में what mistake that we are making? Every chap is an engineer. जिसको देखो वो engineer. What about the other issues? There are humanities, there is history, there is so much to learn from these, so this is something that we must do. I told you about Kamraj. Leadership comes from all faces. Look at Mahavir Phogat. Mahavir Phogat of Dangal fame. What was he? He was just a wrestler. But why was he a distinct leader? There's that quote in that movie of his where he says very common sense deduction, earthy leadership. He says, chora ho ya chori, gold to gold hota hai. Leader. And he realizes what is the other problem his daughters faced? That, they would be hounded by those, those loafers on the streets. But he was a wrestler himself. He could take care of them. This chora-chori business he sorted out and took where his... So when I was thinking of that, he plunged his daughters into the wrestling ring and then to fame. So this is this earthy kind of leadership. Wisdom, as I said, these combinations are very good. Economist historian Sanjeev Sanyal, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Council, look at this view that he's taking on history. You may differ, but it is well researched, it is well documented, a new view of history is emerging. Historians, strategic affairs specialists, people like Neil Ferguson, Mr. Chandrachud, he says wisdom tells you that when you judge others, do not be judgmental. Now these are all these smaller nuances of, in sum, this virtue of wisdom will make you a better man. It will help grow respect for you among those around you. elevate your stature as a leader, and you will soon realize that you are being acknowledged as a leader. So that's something, that you must try and do. This other point, being smart, I've said this, this loftiness, strategy with tactics. This Rudyard Kipling, those first two lines from those of you who read it, it tells you what a leader should do. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch. I mean, there's wonderful phrases. And please don't chuck them out just because they are English. Aajkal fashion hai ki jo bhi English hai usko bahar phek do. Uski please retain the wisdom of it. And I think it is very good. Somebody told me this behavioral postulate. Somewhere it's in my subconscious mind. Very simple statement, but do try and follow it. I found it was really worth it. He says, in your dealings, be civil with all, sociable with many, familiar with few, friendly with one. See, in life you will have only one friend. The way life moves, ultimately ek hi do bachte hain. But be enemy of none. This distinction that we have ceased to draw between an adversary and an enemy is not wise. If you can somehow do this, you will gain, acceptability as a leader. I want to make one point again about this civilizational wisdom. Two quotes. What this neglect has cost us. Look at this Chanakya. We were brought up reading Henry Kissinger, John Mearsheimer, as these, thinkers from the realist school. Now, if you believe in the realist school, look at Chanakya. What clarity. And I had discovered this in the 55th year of my existence. I wish I had discovered it. He says, Shas ko bhuloge, to apni sanskriti kho doge. Don't forget the wisdom of your civilizational text. Agar shas ka tyag karoge, to rashtra hi kho doge. Now, I'm not saying you agree with him, but if you believe in the instrument of force in your strategic calculus, here it is. Is spirituality divorced from power? I don't think so. Mahatma Gandhi of all people said that true power speaks softly. It has no reason to shout. So the quiet accumulation of power is what India needs. Look at what Guru Tegh Bahadur says. He says, Bal hoye, bandhan toote, sab kuch lage upaye. The English translation is better. He says, when strength accrues, shackles snap. Every move seems a stratagem. When China today has acquired this power, वो कुछ भी करता है, the world wonders. ये कर दिया, ये हो जाएगा. India should be like that. Quietly accumulate your power, let the world wonder. We are doing the opposite. We are assessing what China is doing because we don't have power. So the quiet accumulation of power itself is wisdom in state, so this myth that India is only a land of spiritual thinkers and not strategically wise men is also something that should be said. Communications. Now it's pretty important. Let me give you 2-3 quotes to drive home my point. Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. I think this is wonderful. He says communications is a deep construct. Watch your thoughts, he says, they become your words. Watch your words, they become your actions. Your actions become your habits. Your habits, your character. And your character, ultimately, your destiny. Just think over this. So communications is not about coming on a platform and just being glib, one quote here, one quote there. I think it's a very deep construct. This brevity in communication is, acquiring strange forms. That day I heard Savannah Azmi narrate this about her nephew. She says she messaged something to him and he sent a message back K. So she says, he got annoyed. She says, what is this K? He says, I was saying, okay. This is height of brevity. Recently I had gone to speak at an event in JNU. So civilians have this great problem with with the army biodata. They'll run from battalion to battalion, as mine was this morning. And most of them, today it was done very well. Most of them will pronounce core as cops and all that. And that PVSM will get embarrassingly, today it was done very well. So there was this smart MC who came up in JNU. He must have seen my 2-page CV and he says one line. He says, General Shukla has spent long years in the army and has contributed greatly to the safety and security of the nation. Character is central to communications. Ram Jethmalani has said this about somebody, I won't name it, but the quote is very important. He says, communications are important if they come up when they matter. He says, sitam ke daur mein wo to ahle dil hi kaam aaye. In moments of crisis, it was the large-hearted, the good-hearted, wo hi kaam aaye. Jinhe naaz tha zubaan par, wo to bezubaan nikle. How wonderfully put. So it tells you that you must also speak at the right moment or it is useless. The good-hearted are more valuable than the merely glib. I was attending, when I was a major, I attended the staff college where you have a galaxy of speakers from Romila Thapar to Veer Sanghvi those days, and a whole lot of people came. P.N. Haksar spoke to us. The one man who got a standing ovation was Sachin Pilot's father, Rajesh Pilot. He was Minister for Home. And he got a standing ovation in an army audience where you're not supposed to clap. If you clap, it's crime. Standing, spontaneous. He spoke, if you go back to his days, he was not a very good speaker, certainly not very, shall we say, correct in English, but because he spoke from his heart. In English, from his heart, may be grammatically wrong, but the message was more powerful than the words. So these are, these nuances of communication. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, why is this a great communicator? Tavleen Singh writes in one of her books, and she came to the War College, she narrated this incident also. It is the ability to sense the moment, the audience, and the wordplay to match the audience and the moment. Now that's a very deep quality, and this example is very striking. She says, Mr. Vajpayee is released from jail after the emergency. So, freedoms are at peril, and the whole nation is upset about this. And he's going to address one of his first public meetings. And Tavleen is traveling with him, and she says, ki, Vajpayee ji, aaj kya kehna hai? So he says, Tavleen, abhi socha nahi. Soch raha hu, no piece of paper, nothing. And he says, then he goes into deep quiet. And about 5 minutes before the destination, he says, Tavleen, aaj kavita se shuru karenge. It turns out to be a couplet, but this is now what amazes me about this is, this couplet is to a gathering of about 1 lakh plus ordinary people in the vicinity of Delhi, laborers, rickshawalas, and he had the courage to sound this verse to them, and look at the response. And what is this verse? He senses the moment and he says, badi muddat se mile hain deewani. You are mad at the loss of your freedoms. I am mad at Indira Gandhi. So we are both mad. Badi muddat se mile hain deewani. Kehne sunne ko bade hain afsane. We have many stories to tell. Now he's making the point. He says, khuli hawa mein jara saans to le le, kab tak rahe azadi kaun jane. And Tavleen says, that moment it finishes, the crowd breaks into a rapturous applause. And I think it's in a book, The Darbar, read it. And she says, I knew that a Prime Minister had been born. Now you look back, look at the risk he takes with these rickshawalas and that. Firstly, he recalls that couplet from jail without a piece of paper. I've got, 100-page notes to speak for 60 minutes. Takes that thing, senses the moment and conveys it. Now, I'm sure this is an accumulation of experience of many years. But this is why, perhaps, it makes this... we also must learn, I told you how China has crafted a story, we must have this strategic communications, perceptions bit in organization and everywhere else. Because as this quote tells us, unless the lions have their own historians, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. As simple as that. If you don't have people to tell your stories, you will have the West telling your stories. So we do need these, these storytellers. Yuval Harari puts it very well. He says the money is the most artificial, powerful story in the world. He says no basis of it. He argues that it is just a story which has been made up. It allows us to exchange values across borders, commodities, money printing. It's led to these banks. They are all components of the larger story called money, but it's just a story. And he says everybody believes in it. He says the world is so fiercely divided. ISIS hates the Americans. So when the Americans were forced out of Iraq and Afghanistan, they burned their posters, the American, whatever vestiges had been left of American buildings. But bank nahi jalaya unhone. Cash nahi jalaya. Uspe to sab president ke naam chape hue the. Because when ISIS realizes the value of money, it is a story. That gets me thinking that, and I've seen this play out and there's no time, the time when we were doing so well on insurgency in the ground, we were carrying all the losses. And you go to Western capitals in ISIS, it has 4 Pakistani colonels, and the story was there that India was the aggressor and they were the aggrieved. Can you imagine this? Doing all the good work here, losing lives, and we were taking great pride in this, and the Western capitals were buying the story. That's the first time it struck me that you have to sell your stories positively. There is, nothing, this thing, I told you about this great hoax called the Peaceful Rise. It's the most elaborate story of strategic deception perhaps ever executed in the world. They fooled everybody, and what we have come to as a consequence. About this military leadership, I just want to make one point since we are running off time, that, see, every organization has a legacy. I'm sure you must have yours, and we must be very proud of that legacy. Look at this legacy. This army has not been created like this. It has, of course, had great stories of valor. It has had outstanding field commanders. Sagat Singh, he was not even commissioned in the Indian Army. He was commissioned into the ranks of the Bikaner State Force. The first language he spoke was Marwadi. He had to learn English. He learns English, tops the exam in India, tops the exam abroad. Who spots him? Manekshaw. They are two different people. Manekshaw is this, charismatic, English-speaking. Sagat is an entirely different genre. But a talented man spots a talented man and puts him through. Notice he's always in the right places. When the Chinese have to be sorted out, he's in Nathula. When the Nagas have to be sorted out, he's GOC Nagaland. And most critically, the dash to Dhaka, which the London Times has compared with the Blitzkrieg. Now, those of you who understand military history, the Blitzkrieg was one of the most imaginative and fascinating military maneuvers ever. Coming together of technology, speed, mobility. The London Times compares him with Patton. And I'm sure this audience has not heard of Sagat Singh. That is the tragedy of this country, or of us. And therefore, this military history is so important. You don't believe me, you read this thing. We've had many valorous leaders, Porus, Prithviraj Chauhan, Rana Pratap, Lakshmi Bai. They all lost their battles. They were valorous, but defeated. Sagat was Veer or Vijay. He is the only corps commander to have carried out a successful operation dash to Dhaka. And it altered the geography of this continent. It created a nation. And look how he has done it. Both Manekshaw and this guy, they are studies in risk-taking which matured over the years. Sagat is a huge risk-taker. Many incidents of his, he keeps taking those risks. Nathula, he says, despite instructions, I will not vacate Nathula. There were instructions to vacate. I think the other place, Jalepla, has got vacated. Jalepla is with the Chinese. He doesn't vacate as a two-star. He defies instructions. When it comes to the dash to Dhaka, his GOC is Jagjit Singh Arora. And he knows that Sagat will do some mischief. So the orders for Sagat are that Sagat, you will not cross the Meghna, the river. And Sagat writes in his biography, he says, moment Jagjit Singh Arora told me, he says, I concluded that if I reach Meghna, I will cross it and get to Dhaka. And the night he reached, and I'm not saying that you defy orders, but see what Sagat says. Now this is leadership. On the night that Sagat reaches Meghna against all odds, and that's another fascinating story, he employs heliborne operations when they were not being taught in our colleges. His ability to take risks, to find ways out, and from the ranks, humble beginnings. He was not from Sandhurst, not from any of our fancy academies. And when he's asked, Sagat is asked, Jagjit Singh Arora comes on the line and says, Sagat, you will not cross the Meghna. Now Sagat gets stern. He says, sir, it is the duty of a corps commander to exploit opportunities. I see Dhaka beyond. I am in a position to cross Meghna, and I cross it now. Now, if he had not got Dhaka, he would have got court-martial, in defiance of orders. He got Dhaka and everything got forgotten. Now, this is what makes leaders. And who was his mentor? Sam Manekshaw, somebody of similar genre. So we had many of these. We've had technology leaders. There's a chap called R.N. Batra, G.D. Gokhran, a civilian, an appointee those days. He was called the engineer-in-chief of Overseas Communication Service. He says that Batra had the vision and scientific temper of Homi Bhabha, Vikram Sarabhai and Satish Diwan. Look at our guys, Arjun Singh, Manekshaw, Sagat, they got the Padma Vibhushan. Thimaya got the Padma Bhushan. Thorat got the Padma Shri. Why? Because he was the only man in 62 who spoke truth to power, who pointed out to Nehru the threat building up, which was ignored. Mr. Nehru's grace was that when 62 went wrong, he called him out of retirement, acknowledged he made a mistake, And so I'm telling you that the Indian Army's legacy, Thakur Nathu Singh, he was a proud Rajput who didn't believe in any of these British traditions. He refused to go to the mess. One of his British COs in his CR writes that he treated coming to the mess as doing the British a favor. Having meal with lesser mortals. That was the fierceness of the Rajput tradition in him. His wife was in Parda, but here was this man. In that staff college examination, he beat all the Brits. He would have been a chief. He was very close to Sarojini Naidu. They were talking of how the Indian Army should evolve. In the 30s, he talks of a two-front threat. In the 30s, now that is something, some perspicacity. How do we get undone? In a gathering, Mr. Nehru is discussing, about the future of the military leadership. And he says that, I don't think we are mature enough. We should continue to retain British leaders for a while. So the Navy says yes, the Air Force says yes, and for a while after independence, they continue to have British leaders. Thakur Nathu Singh says no. He says, we are okay for it. There's Thimaya, we have all the experience and we can become. So Mr. Nehru insists. He says that you have no experience. So Thakur Nathu Singh has the guts to tell him, if we have no experience, Mr. Prime Minister, may I know what experience do you have? Now, I'm not saying that you do this and all, but this is our panoply. This is the wide, rich legacy of the Indian Army, and I'm sure of every other institution. Look at this quote, this point that I'm making of, being wide-angled people. This is General Fred Franks of the US Army Desert Storm. He says, soldiers are not always what most of them are seen or often portrayed to be. Apart from being robust in their soldiering in the essentials of combat, the best of them are thoughtful students of their profession, scholarly commentators on history, shrewd practitioners of statecraft, and gifted observers of human psychology. The profession of arms is every bit and broad as deep as medicine or law. Like attorneys, they must plan everything in exquisite detail, because on some areas you have but one chance to get it right. A good soldier is also perhaps one of the most undramatic people, one who gets the job done and moves on without fanfare to the next mission, leaving accomplishment in his wake. Now, I'm not saying it happens across the board, but it is a very lofty attribute to live up to for somebody in the whole military. I will just give you two examples of, Sam. He's portrayed to be this charismatic, but why this man had so much depth in him? You see these decisions that he takes. He had this wit, a way of self-effacing way of, not making much of things, so people thought he was just flamboyant. But he was a very hard-working, strong-charactered man. So when he was asked, about how he became a chief, now look at his typical self-effacing way. He says, I was rotting as a Major General. Krishna Menon had vowed to finish me off, but the Chinese came to my rescue. So thankfully, they did what they did. They were looking for generals to command defeated corps, and I was picked up to them. But now, what do we go and do there? The wit masks his substance. He goes there and he says that, gentlemen, I have arrived. Henceforth, there will be no withdrawals. Go back and occupy your posts. Now think of the army then, which had been pushed back. The Chinese were coming down to the plains of Assam. Mr. Nehru had virtually thrown in the towel to tell an army of that kind. And he just walks away, no questions, nothing. This world travels to Delhi. So Mr. Nehru, General Chaudhary, the chief, and Indira Gandhi, who's nobody then, but the Prime Minister the daughter of the Prime Minister, they come. And he gives the same briefing, and he's sought to be persuaded that so many people have died, this is not the time to inflame things. Many of us would have said, okay, wait for a while, He sticks to his guns and he says, all right, don't want, find another guy, I'm not going. So Indira Gandhi, I'm told, pulls, Mr. Nehru is in a rage. He's after all the Prime Minister. Indira Gandhi pulls her father aside and says, Dad, as it is we are defeated, there are hardly any few people, this one man holding, let him hold, we'll see. But in Manekshaw's mind, that was the beginning of the strategic rejuvenation of the Indian Army in mind, to say that, listen, the Chinese may be powerful, but they are not 10 feet tall. We have to stand our ground. And it's this one, Nathula Sagat, mentored by Manekshaw, Sumand Rongchu, and a whole lot of other things, which finally, has led to the Indian Army now to be able, from the depths of 62 to where it is. So Manekshaw is responsible not only for the great victory against Pakistan, but also the strategic rejuvenation against China. He had this, look at his guts, when he's the GOC 26 Division, Krishna Menon, who's then hounding a lot of people and particularly targeting Manekshaw. He lands up because he was told that Manekshaw is this whiskey-toting, westernized guy. So there was this whole setup against him. So he goes and mischievously asks him, he says, Manekshaw is the major, no, Thimaya is the chief. He says, Sam, what do you think of Thimaya? So Sam says, sir, on the army, we are under orders not to think about our superiors. So Krishna Menon says, Sam, you can't be so dumb. Sure you have an opinion on him? He's a 2-star, and he says, sir, I have an opinion on him, but if I express that, I must also tell you what I think of you. Now he said it and he got away with it. Now these are all true stories. So Manekshaw is such a perplexing character in leadership because there is this charisma, there is this deep substantiveness. For example, when he tells Indira Gandhi on tactical operational reasons that we can't go into Bangladesh. So, this ability to stand up, to be witty, to be self-effacing is what makes this... Also, tell me one last anecdote about him. Look at this. Grace. I forget the person's name, Brigadier something. He is related to Biji Kaul, who was one of his adverse competitors in his career, and Biji Kaul, who went and did all that. He's actually the cause of 1962. His brother-in-law, who had deposed against Manekshaw when he was a 2-star. When Manekshaw is the chief, his case comes to him for promotion. The promotion board recommends that he be promoted. Manekshaw picks up the phone, speaks to the defense secretary and says, I don't think he should be made because of these reasons. But since I am a personal party to this, I will send the recommendations of the board without my comments and you decide. And that man makes it. And Manekshaw doesn't object. Most of us would have gone out of the way to make sure that he doesn't become. And if he had put his foot down, he was a powerful chief. He would not have become. Now these are, some of the most outstanding, qualities of Manekshaw. There are so many others. I think I've run out of time. I wanted to tell you about, or just let me one quote, Nani Palkhiwala. I want to give you, you read this book called Courtroom Genius. And I think I was discussing in the boardroom. The Chief Justice was talking the other day or Mr. Lalit, that if you want the independence of the judiciary, make sure that your lawyers are icons. The bar should be powerful. Mr. Palkhiwala never sat on the bench, but you read this book, Courtroom Genius. H.R. Khanna, after that decisive vote in the Keshavanand Bharti case, he says, it was not Nani who spoke. It was divine spirituality that we heard. Can you imagine somebody saying this about a lawyer? Divine spirituality. He says the presiding judges would take a week to come out of the spell Palkhiwala would cast with the power of his words and the depth of his arguments. A judge saying that about a lawyer. I mean, there must be something to that man. I just recall him very peripherally because of his budget speeches. Now here was a lawyer trained in income tax lawyer, and his speeches on the budgets were a huge rage here in Delhi. 100 lakh or 1 lakh plus people. And once again without... So, such people, they compete only with themselves. They take excellence to a new high. And once again, in that generation, when everybody was with a degree from Oxford or Cambridge, he had no godfather in the legal profession, not a degree from a foreign university, not a barrister, and he became this huge success. The last man I would like to point out is Arun Shore. Now, you may disagree with this man, but once again, as a scholar, crusader, author, minister, he's a one-stop shop for excellence. Once again, I don't know why it all converges in law. He's written a book called The Courts and Their Judgments. A journalist writing a book about courts and their judgments. And look at what people say. Chief Justice of India Venkat Chalaya, I'm amazed that a man with no legal training has such a deep, formidable dissection of court judgments. An outstanding effort. Fali Nariman, an extraordinary book, unputdownable. I have had the occasion to meet him once, and I'll tell you the humility of this man. So I had written a dissertation on civil-military relations, and I wanted somebody to comment on it. And since he was some kind of icon to me, I just wrote a mail to him. And he had just demitted office as a minister. He had already been a minister. And promptly a mail comes back. It was not known to me. He says, I'm traveling to Chennai 2 weeks from now, I will also come to Wellington. It will be a great pleasure meeting you. And you send me I sent him the paper. The same night it was back with comments. A minister who had demitted office. So when he comes to Wellington, I go at the anointed time to meet him. He's standing outside to receive. I said, I'm a brigadier, you're a minister. He said, no, sir. And that was his way, it was his humility, it was to put you at ease. I hold army officers in great esteem. And see, I'm not boasting, but he says, आपने इतना बढ़िया dissertation लिखा, उसमें एक ही mistake थी. Howard was spelled with a W or not a V. Now, I don't know whether he was being this thing, but this whole man, if he actually acknowledged what I had written, it speaks volume. The fact that he comes out, this humility, and now you just go back, those of us who know him know he's a great man. We may disagree with him, but you read as the editor of Indian Express, he and Ramnath Goenka, I mean, they really showed you what press freedom was. And I would just, like to give you this quote from him. He says, why is this so important? Of course, in that same book, he makes a lovely quote of a role of a free press, which is very good to recall. He exemplifies this exchange between Rajiv Gandhi and Ram Jethmalani. Ram Jethmalani those days is, throwing out those 10 questions and so So Rajiv Gandhi says one day in annoyance, he says, I don't answer dogs that bark. Ram Jethmalani says, I am a watchdog. I bark when I see a thief. Mr. Shore, when he describes this, he says, why a free press is so important. We need the right sort of people, leaders who live up to high standards, lofty values. I do not mean abstract philosophies, but when ordinary men जो अपने अधिकार क्षेत्र में ही मर्यादा को सुरक्षित रख सकें. Now this Hindi bit is my translation. I found this better. So small men who can protect their areas of influence. If wrongdoings, infirmities are not exposed at the first instance, if regulators are ineffective or inefficient, they lead to far bigger problems. It is important, therefore, that everyone in every institution lives up to high standards. But the best will always slacken. Even the best will slacken if they are not monitored. Unless they are rewarded for standing up for what is right and severely punished when they transgress. And so anyone who does wrong, however high or well connected he may be, must be dealt with rightly or decisively. Everyone who does right, howsoever low on the rung he may be and however isolated, must be shielded by all as if by a fortress. Now, some of you may say it is, very idealistic and all, but he did this in his times as the editor of the Indian Express. The next point is leadership of thought and change. Okay, just now let me come to this last 2 points. Under promise, over deliver. The point that I wish to make here is that, let me tell you this. Human nature essentially is fair. Please do not waste time speculating otherwise. I was having this discussion with your boss. I have seen this, and I've been an army commander, seen it on panels in the UPSC today. If a chap is good, 10 times out of 10, the universal voice you hear is that this chap or this lady is good. Nobody says otherwise. But I've also been on the outside. And I've also had perception, यार वो अंदर वो कुछ ऐसे बैठा था, इस तरह से उसने मेरे को देखा, लग नहीं रहा था कि आज. We all go through these worries. And when I look back, they were absolutely unnecessary worries. So please believe this. Your mentors will come from the most unlikely of quarters. You will not know whom your mentors are, but somebody has spotted you, somebody has discovered something in you. It is very important to consciously be a man or woman of your own making. Be self-made. Greater acceptance, there is greater acceptance in the long run. In my own career, since I was in the army, I have seen many sons and son-in-laws of generals who appeared momentarily ascendant in their careers, but just withered away. It doesn't last. Be self-made. There is again this lovely quote of being self-made. उन्होंने तमाम उम्र अकेले सफर किया, उन पर कभी किसी खुदा की इनायत न रही. I mean, if you somehow can live up to these things, I am also a strong believer, and therefore I say this: under promise, over deliver. Find your USP, deliver on it quietly. Let the world discover it. You don't need to advertise it. Let them surprise them with your competence. Surprise them with your industry. This is a virtue that I feel is extremely important. Be quietly diligent. Once again, this couplet sums it up beautifully. It says, खामोशी से बनाते रहो पहचान अपनी. खामोशी से बनाते रहो पहचान अपनी. But that पहचान doesn't mean just, drifting away smoking. Hard work. खामोशी से बनाते रहो पहचान अपनी. हवाएं खुद तुम्हारा तराना गुनगुनाएंगी. I say this from experience. I believe in this, and therefore It is against that lobby which says net worth, this, that, and the other. I don't think it works in the long run. And this last point about nice guys finishing second. This point, what I wish to make is, see, you look at Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw. He was exacting, but not ruthless. There has to be a magnanimity. When you are right at the top, there will be such fierce competition that you will have to make these choices. Be very good, but don't be ruthless. This is the advice that I have. Be demanding, be trusting and large-hearted. Atal Bihari Vajpayee again said this. He says, "Chote man se koi kabhi bada nahi hua hai." With a small mind, you don't become big. This fictional exchange, it's fictional because they were in two different generations. You have two kinds of leaders, Iqbal and Ghalib. So Iqbal says, "Udne do in parindo ko azad fiza mein Ghalib. Jo tere honge lautayenge kisi roz." Let people under you grow. Let them prosper. This is one kind of leadership I see. There is Ghalib, not Ghalib necessarily, fictional. He says, "Na kar etbar in parindo par Iqbal." There are these kind of leaders. जब पर निकल आते हैं तो अपने भी पराये हो जाते हैं. Now you have to choose, but I will plumb for Iqbal. And you will find these leadership styles. In the long run, it gets most. Abraham Lincoln says, this is a very good thing, sell your brain and brawn to the highest bidder. Compete physically. If you have wares, sell them. Put your talent on the line. But there always comes a time, never put a price tag on your heart and soul. I think this line we will do. That officer I was talking of was Brigadier Inder Vora. His name has just come, that I mentioned in the case of, So at the end of the day, I would say this, that you must compete hard, compete vigorously. Leadership is a very important domain in institutions. See, today, I have a hunch, there's this leadership contest developing between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, of who will take the nation when. If you go back to 62, there were many reasons, but what Mao didn't like was that, the Chinese were these village revolutionaries, not sophisticated, and Nehru was the toast of these Western capitals. He says this in a conversation to Chow En-lai sometime. This could also be one of those. So, these leadership contests are very important. I would like to end with this, verse. It is Nida Fazli, which sums up leadership in life in some beautiful way. So, I'll just take 2 minutes, because I think when I go through this, I recount my own benchmarks in life, and it is so true. It is also what the Prime Minister, narrated in the Raj Sabha on the March 2016 motion of thanks. Many would you see it on video, but it's fascinating. It is a message, but let us go through it for the sheer joy of the couplet. It's beautiful. Its essences are many. One of it is that life is not always fair. You have to. But he says it so beautifully. He says, "Safar mein dhoop to hogi, jo chal sako to chalo." It's a grim fight. This whole business is a grim fight. There are no free lunches. And along any path there will be adversity. Sabhi hai bheed mein, tum bhi nikal sako to chalo. There is a crowd out there. There's nobody waiting for Raj Shukla or somebody to. There's a crowd out there. You look at back, today we were discussing, we started off in NDA. There were 305 of us. There were 4 who became Lieutenant Generals. One is the current chief, Manoj Pandey. One is me and 2 others. I mean, that is the way life is. Now you make 5 or 4 out of 300, God knows what the percentage is, but that it is. Idhar udhar hain kai manzile, chal sako to chalo. Bane banaye hain saache, tum bhi dhal sako to dhalo. There are multiple destinations. Choose your journeys, choose your pathways. There are also fixed templates. Now, initially in your journey, you will have to dhalo into these templates. It is not that once you can create your own empire. So you have to initially do this. So choices and adaptations. Dhal sako to dhalo. Kisi ke waaste rahein kahan badalti hain? Tum apne aap ko khud badal sako to chalo. Nobody is waiting to change things for you. When people say life is not fair, it is not meant to be fair. It is bloody well not fair. You just have to live it. But if you are good, you succeed. But it is not as simple as that. Life is not only is fair. Yahan kisi ko koi rasta nahi deta. Yahan kisi ko koi rasta nahi deta. Mujhe gir kar agar tum sambhal sako to chalo. It's so beautiful. Nobody is going to make way for you. So many times you feel you're on the brink, but you learn to survive. So you have to survive this constant shoving, jostling and toppling. And this is wonderful. Yahi hai zindagi, kuch khwab, kuch ummeedein. Inhi khilonon se tum bhi behal sako to chalo. I mean, this is absolutely wonderful that this is life. It's a journey of hopes, desires, aspirations and dreams, and they change. Many times in my own career, I thought I've had enough of the army. I should do something else somewhere. I mean, for many, so we all go through this. If you can juggle these toys with skill, walk along or drop out. Walk along. हर एक सफर को है महफूज रास्तों की तलाश. Every journey is in search of a safe and successful path. Everybody wants to be safe and successful. And now is it? हिफाजतों की रिवायत बदल सको तो चलो. In time you will have the power to change the very rules of the game. When that time comes, do not hesitate to do it. That may be your moment. And that may be that may be the beginning of your own leadership style. Every journey is in search of a safe and successful path. Often to find your own, you will need to change its very metrics. कहीं नहीं कोई सूरज, धुआं धुआं है फिजा, खुद अपने आप से बाहर निकल सको तो चलो. If you can push yourself, if you can bring out the best that lies within you, you will discover that the sun is elusive but not beyond your grasp. If you can do all this, push yourself, bring out the best, survive all that jostling, you will penetrate the uncertain fog and find the sunlight. Now this is my own translation, very amateur, but I just did it so that this whole thing goes. But this couplet is beautiful because it captures the journey of life and leadership, I think, in very, very profound ways. Last point I would like to make is about this Elon Musk. See, look at this guy, and I'll just take 30 seconds. When I and you were growing up, space was a country thing. We said, who were the space powers? India, Soviet Union, and we spoke about space in hushed tones. It was strategic. And this guy wakes up one day and says that I want to put these rockets in space. You read this book, Elon Musk, it is by Ashley Vance. It's a fascinating book. And what is the metric he makes? He says, what is the cost of sending these rockets to space? He says it is so expensive, I can get down the cost everywhere else except the launches. So now I want to create my launches. And how will the launches become cost effective? By making them precise. Reusable rockets. So you send them and recover them. And he put the best minds on it. And look at the things that he has gone through. Now it's impossible to be Elon Musk. It's just, inspiration. He models his companies, SpaceX and Tesla. He says that they just must not be acmes of science. They must lie at the intersect of personal genius, acme of science, and the best practices of business, science, business. So what does he do? He says the people who were coming out of America those days, they were not quite happy with the slow ways of the space industry. So he said, I'll create this startup, this whole environment, which will be flat, which will be meritocratic, which will be well-paying. And he creates this host culture which attracts these talents. And what are the tests? Apart from long essays, you have to make these 500 codes in certain minutes and all. That's how he gets the talent in. And now look at his gumption. He flies to Moscow. Those Moscow chaps, they are amazed. He says, I've come to buy your rockets if you can do a deal with me. Imagine Russians, they are amazed. They say, listen, they are perplexed. We send technology for war, not for capitalist billionaires to purchase and have fun with. Buzz off. But he's persistent. He lands up a second time. So this time they try to make a fool of him. They say, okay, we'll give you 3 rockets for $21 million. And they do the deal. When he comes the third time, they tell him no, $21 million per rocket. Essentially to push him out of the business. This man comes and is close to that 2008 moment. So there are these two tech businesses of his, SpaceX and Tesla. The SpaceX has had its 3rd consecutive launch failure. His own rocket. The Russians are not giving him a rocket. And the Tesla is going bankrupt. All the money that he's made from PayPal, $180 billion, he says, I have 2 choices. Either I divide them between the 2, either I put them with one, save one baby, let the other die, because they're all his passions. He says, at the end of this, I just put them in 2. He divides it into 2. And he says, by a stroke of luck, both succeed. The 4th launch becomes a success and Tesla becomes. Now, this is a maverick who succeeded, but what in the process, what is his leadership achievement? He has made a country thing, a company thing. Today, the partner of Spacecom is not NASA, it is Elon Musk. You see his debates, there's an annual space conference. Annually it's held. It's held with the 4-star boss of the Spacecom. Go over the years, you will find each time the Spacecom boss's chair is becoming lower and Musk's chair is becoming higher. The whole power in the space business is gravitating towards Elon Musk. Now this is, this whole maverick in leadership. So that's the last point I wanted to make. So that should be all. Thank you very much. Since I've given you so many quotes, let me sign off with this last quote. Why leadership is so important. It says, when a clown moves into a palace, he does not become the king. The palace becomes a circus. So the leader is so important, and I've emphasized it in so many ways. It applies across value chains and hierarchies in leadership. That is how important leaders and leadership are. I hope I have been mildly successful in driving home the message. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much, sir, for that insightful and mesmerizing session. So we have a question from Rudra Mishra. I request if Rudra can unmute themselves to ask the question. So, okay. So I think I'll go ahead, sir, and ask the question. So why has the world not been able to decode China in its true sense? Should we be learning out of this as to how we must not let ourselves be decoded, minus the negative connotations of it being a closed society, which of course China is.
So, you asked this question of China being a closed society. We were, I think, discussing over breakfast. Kishore Mehbubani makes this lovely quote for us to reflect on. This is when we explain many of our failures on this premise that we are a raucous democracy, we debate, and we think better, but we execute badly. That's the logic I heard generally in Delhi, that we are wise men, but we are in no hurry and, we cannot execute like him. Challenge is that China is ideating better than us. And forget us, he's ideating better than the Americans. The Americans concede that in all 5 emerging domains, including artificial intelligence, China leads. In a recently conducted competition in Stanford, it's called the Stanford Gold in AI, who wins? China, not the US. And how has it happened? It's not happened by happenstance. I quoted that 1,000 plan to you. They have worked on the universities, their academia for years. They have invested in technology. Sometimes, I'll tell you what, this 5G, there's this whole talk of 5G. We are told that 5G has arrived in Delhi. What do the Chinese think of 5G? Why the 5G, Huawei 5G creates such a scare? They were talking of integrating 5G with facial recognition and a whole lot of other modern technologies to create this surveillance state. Now you can use this for good effect and for bad effect. So what would a surveillance state be in Beijing like? This is the power of technology. So they say if you are not a good citizen by Chinese standards and you stepped out of your hotel in Beijing and you said Uber, this whole connect of 5G, facial recognition and all, and identify you as a bad citizen, Uber will not come. You keep saying Uber, 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 it will not come. You order a burger, the burger will not come. Now this is what they are taking, that whole technology to create a surveillance state to encourage their good citizens. But the point was that Europe was sleeping. The other thing about 5G I've read somewhere is that the whole difference between 4G and 5G is that 4G you can calibrate different systems in software and hardware. You can calibrate different systems in the core and the peripherals. In 5G you can't do it. It is one integrated whole. So you either have Huawei or you have Ericsson. And Ericsson is behind the curve. Ericsson is behind the curve because if you take the R&D spends of Huawei and Ericsson over the years, Huawei started doing it long better. So this thinking then in the 1980s said that so what if the Middle East has oil? We have rare earths. And they spend time on creating this whole rare earth ecosystem which is powering their digital economy and even digital combat. What amazes me, see, even in the military field, I was recounting this to your CEO. Sometime in the 2000s, there's the chairman of the National Defense University, and I call this whole thing, from humility to hubris. This is China's rise. In humility, he says, we wrote every word that Andrew Marshall spoke, or we translated every word that Andrew Marshall spoke or wrote.
We study him greatly. Who's Andrew Marshall? He's a big strategist who has advised 8 American presidents across the aisle. He, when the Cold War with the Soviet Union was at its peak, told the American president that look at China, and China's rise is not going to be peaceful. But he was ignored because that was the heyday of America, China, bhai bhai, like we were bhai bhai at one time, America, China, bhai bhai. And that was humility. Their hubris is that one of these IPAC conferences, one of these Chinese generals walks up to me in the context of this free oceans and this 12 nautical mile business, and says, see, when the Americans have 43 bases around you and every day send a ship to check out that notion, is it military coercion or is it freedom of seas? 43 bases, I didn't know. And he said, anyway, that is an academic question. The real question will be that in 2035, people will not ask whether Chinese American ships should stay off 12 nautical miles of Shanghai. The question will be whether American and Chinese ships should stay 12 nautical miles of California. And look at how they are working. And they are looking at penetrating the first island chain. They're looking at penetrating the second island chain. And it's not a military endeavor. Neil Ferguson says, and we must pay very careful attention to this. He says, as the American voices of military intervention in Taiwan are going stronger, military abilities to intervene in Taiwan are growing weaker. And who will know it? Both the militaries. Both the militaries. By 2035, many studies say that 24% of global GDP will come not from America. We always thought 24% has to be America. It will come from China. And where is America? 14%. So we are in Cold War 2.0. Henry Kissinger says foothills. I think we are in the mid-slopes of Cold War. This intense thing and this intense competition is brewing on the back of great technology, and also Chinese are leading in ideation, they are leading in execution, the Americans are worried, and so should we worried. And Neil Ferguson says that this will be the Suez moment for America. Suez moment was when the British realized that their power has waned. Now, if this is the significant nature of change in Chinese power, we in India should, my whole plea is that while we are aware of the challenge, the import and gravity of that challenge has to be understood. And it is not a whole of government challenge, it is a more than government challenge. It is everything coming together, academia, business, the military to take care of this challenge. And the context of, I think they are leading in thought and ideation. Can we do better? Of course we can. We have both. We should do that. The Americans have woken up to it. They are doing a whole lot of stuff now. TikTok ko bhi ban kar rahe hain, ye bhi kar rahe hain, wo bhi kar rahe hain. But the point is they have woken up late, and China is ahead.
Thank you so much, sir. So I think one question from the audience.
A soldier is also a human being with emotions. So in your days of counter-insurgency in the J&K region, what specifically, did you train your troops or your field battalion that when they overcome, the loss of their own comrades, the fellow comrades, they overcome this grief and still go on fighting? Was there any specific, guidance which you had given to your team?
Yeah. Of course, emotions are a very strong point, but it is somehow built into the Army's ethos in some very strange ways. I remember a favorite line which goes around in the Army is that, they say gallantry is a tradition and winning is a way of life. That is somehow what is taught to people. And within this notion, we have very strong fallback systems. Or if you have any exposure to the Army, the regiment is like a family. So you take care of these people for life. Apart from what the government does in terms of pensions, this, that, the widow is taken care of life. She's called for all parties, called for all reunions. People turn up for the daughter's wedding, this, that. So it is built into us. It is so deeply ingrained into us that we do not even feel the need for a visible show. Like from here, I'm going to my regiment in Hyderabad for its Diamond Jubilee. So when I was called for it, I just had to make the adjustment. It is, when we go there, the CO who first groomed me meets me, he's a doddering 93. It's somehow into us, so I cannot flesh it out for you. But all I will say is that It is pretty well taken off, well taken off. The regiment takes care. Whatever the government does, it does. But the regiments, and there's a camaraderie beyond all that. And it's very deep and substantive. Those bonds are real. There is no hollowness to it. You ask the grieved party, they'll tell you. Very often they'll tell you how they have been taken care of. And this is when you have all these Duryodhans and the rules and all, ki ye bhi nahi ho sakta, wo bhi nahi ho sakta. But we fight our way through it. So it's a very strong system. Let me give you one example of emotion, or why these things matter. The ethos. It is superior to the MIML or to any rule. So see, when I was a very young lieutenant, a second lieutenant, there was this Punjab crisis brewing. And I was commissioned into a Sikh unit, an artillery unit, but Sikh. So every day you could make out that the Sikhs were not happy with what Blue Star had happened. So there was a resentment in the troops. You could make it out in the morning PT when you met over them. They were not happy. But see how things play out and how these natural checks and balances kick in. So we've had these, there was a Sikh resentment. Anybody of that era would know that there had been some mutinies in Sikh battalions, and it was a unsavory, it was not a very good time for the Indian Army. Our ethos was being challenged of whether regimental bondings can, survive these greater challenges. That was the essential question. And in my own regiment, so you have these, see, what is secularism for us? So I am a Hindu Brahmin, but I was commissioned into a Sikh unit. So we went for all Gurudwara's functions. Every Sunday religiously we would turn up, we would take part in it. And this unhappiness was showing in those Gurudwaras. They had these rants, Bole, Sonehar and all, and they were getting louder and all. You could sense there was trouble. And in one of these functions, when the ceremony is being held, each of these guys come up and they speak in praise of this Guru, the Lords, the Gurus, the various Gurus. So one of that chap came and started speaking inflammatory stuff. Now, there was a Subedar Major. You heard of these Subedar Major? Why is he such a great character? So when I was commissioned, there was a Subedar Major Jagtar Singh. There was a paunch. 3 buttons used to be open. It's not strict hierarchy. He didn't salute me till I was a captain and I got the silver gun. So, they would not acknowledge authority ordinarily. They would say, ki saab, kuch karke aao, phir salute karenge. And this was despite the CO and all, although hierarchies were there. And you knew that you had not quite got his approval because the Subedar Major had not saluted. Now, where is he in the hierarchy? The captain and all, he's not even an officer, but he's a Subedar Major. Now, this is the strange way in armies operate. Now, he is a very credible character. So nobody liked him because, he was not that typical good man who would salute everybody or isko bhi theek, usko bhi theek. He was disliked. So he used to always speak against him. This man thinks too much of himself. But see the value of this man in crisis. So in this crisis, when everybody else is, if you are not a Sikh, you really don't know how to rebut those arguments that he was making. So I wouldn't say the officer class was ineffective, but the officer class momentarily seemed to have lost its authority. It was then that this man got up, Jagtar Singh, and gave that chap one slap, and I'm not very good at Punjabi, he said, "Tu beja," and gave the counter narrative. And that prevented this unit from getting into a mutiny. So today when people say JCOs ki zarurat nahi hai, Subedar mein, you should not stupidly copy Western traditions, Western systems. They don't understand us. So this is the strength of the army. It's not strictly emotional, but I am talking of the non-hierarchical aspects. It is the larger ethos which keeps the army going, which people outside do not quite understand, but which the army protects fiercely, and it must protect it fiercely for all the right reasons. So I really not answered your question of emotions, because I'm pretty emotionless as an army man. But I just suggested another thing for your consideration.
So thank you so much, sir. So good day to you, Lt Gen Raj Shukla, and wish each one of you a great day ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.